Hello and welcome to the Datum podcast. This is season 2, episode 5, and I'm joined by my co-host Ravi. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm well. I'm very well.
We have a new name.
We do, and you got it wrong to start
I
with.
got it wrong, yeah, to start with. You
Yeah.
didn't hit that, folks. But yeah, this is the Datum podcast. We've kicked our new name into action. So we are now Datum Pod on Twitter,
Yeah.
and you can find us on datumpodcast.com.
Cool. Yeah. No. So no, I quite like the rebrand, the colours, and the logo. If you spotted the logo last week, folks, it was on the album art. Of course, it's going to be changed on the actual podcast itself now. So you'll have a brand new podcast that might look a bit strange and new, but it's still us.
It is a bit weird, but we're talking about behavioral design today. But
Yeah,
one
right.
of those things in podcasts is like when they change their album art, it kind of shocks you, doesn't it? You kind of think, oh, hold on, this is new, this is different.
Yeah.
So it's quite topical actually.
Comes back to habits and what we're used to and all this stuff, right? So
Yeah, exactly. But before we dive into that, let's just do some follow up on the previous episode, which was about champions. What did you think of the show?
no, it was good. Again, like I said, it's a passion topic of mine. These are the conversations I have every day in my day job, right? So this is the sort of stuff I'm doing for our customers, helping them focus in on what they need to do to be successful. So it was really fun to talk about and think about in this structured way. I say structured, but a lot of this podcast comes off the cuff, right? So,
Yeah, exactly.
but the feedback was good actually. I mean, it wasn't huge. We did get a few positive notes. I think there was one gent who's like, actually, this is exactly what I'm doing at work right now. I'm thinking about all this meta level stuff. So, yeah, hopefully, it'll be useful to come. And yeah, I'm hoping that this maybe it's definitely what topic we can keep coming back to, right?
Exactly, and some of this stuff is timeless as ever. I think I was telling you about another topic which I think we need to revisit, having heard another podcast. So we'll come to that a little bit later. But as ever, please send us feedback whenever we do a show or you think something's missing. We always take that feedback on board.
Absolutely.
Right, so behavioral design. I mean, the name of the podcast today is Behavioral Design in Analytics, but I feel like we have to start first at what is behavioral design?
Yeah. Again, if anyone watched my Tableau Fringe Festival talk, it was on about behavioral nudges in design for dashboards, and a lot of that comes back to my sort of roots in behavioral economics. This is we're gonna touch on Tim's favorite topic when I'm going to talk about a dissertation about recycling habits, and the habitual nature of what we do and why we do it is definitely about what where we come to with behavioral design. Because if anyone's read, or if you haven't read, Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein is a book that's fantastic for me, and it really encompasses this idea that you use different aspects either in design or in life to nudge people in the right direction.
It's a really good book, actually. I first came across it through a series of suggestions. Actually, I was at a quantified self meetup, and someone talked about thinking fast and slow in relation to something I was talking about with music by Daniel Kahneman. And then someone else suggested, well, have you actually read this book about nudge? It's actually a really good book. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's actually about health and well-being mostly, but sort of the mechanics behind that, actually, and how we can sort of push people towards a certain choice that's actually good for them.
It's good because we'll talk about some of the ethics of all of this stuff a bit later in the podcast, but it really talks about that sort of thing, because you're typically doing a nudge to drive a positive outcome, but of course it can be used for the opposite.
Exactly, and in many ways, this touches on a couple of the topics we've already talked about. We talked about champions last time around, which is really important because your champions are most often actually tasked with this job of thinking about design in analytics, and so behavioral design would naturally fall into their plate, sort of unknowingly in most cases. And then the other side of this is obviously vis literacy, which we've also talked about previously. It goes back to how do people understand and interact with what they've been presented with.
Yeah, and the other stuff is this sort of branches out into is just about, I want to say just about everything, but I'm going to call out two of the specific ones. First is like general user interface, so UX design, and then the second is gaming. So, for example, for user interface design, you can think about Tinder, for example, completely disrupted the dating game with an app because it was a simple application which allowed you to swipe left or right, like based on what you wanted, and it was just a really simple. Here's your instructions. Here's your cue. Do this, and your reward is if someone likes you, they'll pop up. Otherwise, they're gone forever, basically, right? Similarly, like if we think about like addictive social media applications, the reason these things are addictive is that they're designed in a certain way to either by algorithm or by visual design, all of these different things, to make sure that you keep on scrolling, right? Keep on scrolling past those adverts, keep on being a consumer in this world. And I mentioned with that Tinder example, I mentioned the 3 steps, and that comes down to this car model. It seems to pop up everywhere. It seems to pop up everywhere. Like I can't exactly find where it originated from. I found like The Power of Habit, which is quite a famous book for people that are looking for self-help and like looking to do life improvements. But also in this website that I love, it's called boundlessdesign.ai. They talk about this cue, action, reward, and this can relate to a lot of different things. And it, like for example, in retail, when I think this is one of your specialist subjects, Tim. Like when you're looking at promotions and pricing, where things are placed, like the gondola stand, the end stand.
Oh yeah.
Where it is in relation to like high level or lower level. These are all paid for because the retailers know that positioning, that design choice to put a product, to put a promotion at a certain place is more likely to drive a reward, right? Or
do they?
Right, exactly. That's another.
It's kind of half my work has been actually understanding, do those behaviors actually materialize, or are there other mechanics sort of at work? And it's actually quite a common challenge, whether it's to do with promotions or it's to do with sort of long held myths about how certain behaviors manifest in consumers or even at work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like for example, if you think about gaming, I saw this really great video about Fortnite, the famous game where everyone learned to dab and floss, right? But in this video, one of the designers talked about how they created and came up with the concept of Fortnite, which made it easy and repetitive. And in particular, one of the things that interested me was like the design of the HUD, or the heads-up display, which is basically, in our terms, a dashboard. Because if we go back to the term of what a dashboard is, you think of cars, and a car dashboard gives the information at your fingertips, right? That's what we see as a dashboard, and then perhaps we can even link that back to what we do as a day job, right, Tim?
Yeah, exactly. I think we touched on this topic. There's actually a really good episode called The Dashboard Conspiracy. It's Data Stories podcast episode 135. It's actually a really good one. They go deep into the question of what is a dashboard, which we won't do now, but it touches on a really interesting sort of thing about expectations and behavior, because in many ways what people call a dashboard is irrelevant. What is relevant is how they then end up using it and how they end up consuming the content. And in your example with Fortnite, they managed to build something that could easily be consumed by a wide range of people, and it's a mechanic that makes playing the game much more enjoyable, which I think in the car model is called a reward, right?
Exactly. So the cue would be that everyone's talking about it. The action would be you actually start playing it, and the reward is you kind of it's just a simple game to just pick up and play, right? That's the thing. Like we'll talk about another example of it within gaming later on the podcast, but like with Fortnite, I think that the easiest thing is like it's just, if you're going to pay for more stuff, it's not going to improve your gaming, but
exactly,
it's like suddenly people want all these different dance moves, they all want the different kit, all of this different stuff, just because they want to look good while playing it. But the actual game itself for everyone is the exact same thing, which reduces the overhead. But this isn't a gaming UX podcast. We're talking about behavioral design and analytics specifically.
Exactly, and I think before we dive into it deep, we go in hard. I think it's a really interesting thing, because I maybe I'm misspeaking here, but I get the sense that this is actually a new concept in analytics in the traditional sense, i.e., in organizations. I don't think it's a new concept in app design or gaming or any of these sort of industries which have actually had analytics embedded in them by the nature of what they do, per se. But if you think about users of Power BI, Tableau, ClickView, whatever, we've had this term dashboard sort of thrown at us without much real conceptualization of what actually sits underneath that. And when we build those dashboards, when we build those views, whatever you want to call them, do we think about behavior as we do that? And I think I said it, we touch on visual literacy. Part of that is obviously building things that are easy to consume, but the other part of it, which we don't often think about, is sort of the end result. So once a users use something, do they what is their reward? What is the benefit? Did it help them get to where they needed to go?
Yeah.
And I think this is a very new area in analytics, which I think there are very few people who understand it, to be brutally honest. I couldn't easily find papers on the topic, but I think a lot of people would claim to touch on this topic in sort of one way or form.
But I also think they do, right? I think that they absolutely do, but they just don't realize it in an explicit way. Like they won't say
probably
adding an eye icon to find information or highlighting a text bit in red is a nudge or intentional behavioral design. But it's something that it's almost like in Gujarati we have this term parrot fashion. You're literally parroting what someone else has done because it works. Like it's a tried and tested method. So therefore you're doing it. You're not thinking about why you're doing it. But I think the nice thing about this in how I agree, it has come up very recently. It's one of these cool things that's like the cross subject area thing, right? Because what's interesting about this sort of thing is like, well, if we think about photography, that was a thing for a while in visualizations. Like everyone's thinking about a visualization in the same terms that think about photography with the 9 segments, right? With the foreground background sort of relationship and all of these different things.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if you think about companies like Tableau and Power BI and these companies that sell products off the back of an idea, and this idea is that analytics is accessible through sort of views or portals, or call it portal if you think about things like Tableau server. They've sort of built multi-billion-dollar industries. That's not well understood, and we're still kind of figuring it out, to be brutally honest. I think if you look in the Tableau community, at least, which we know quite well, people are still figuring out things. New features come out and it changes the whole sort of paradigm of expectations. And yet this is a very visualization is a very well-known topic. People like Thomas Edward Tuft. Is that
Tufty?
Yeah, Tufty and
Stephen Few.
Stephen Few. I was about to say Stephen Tufty.
That unholy comparison. Yeah.
Oh wow, that would have gone down like a bomb. But yeah. These guys have been talking about this for a long time. Stephen Few will probably have a very academic understanding of what a dashboard is. Would he agree with David McCandless? Probably not.
Yeah.
But would the users we build dashboards for call them both dashboards? Yes.
Yeah, right.
And so that's a very interesting area.
Now, what I like about that sort of thing is that the concepts introduced by Tufty, by Few, by Cairo, the sort of the people we see as the godfathers of data visualization. A lot of those concepts are now almost outdated because the way we consume information has changed, right?
Yeah, it has.
Because like if you think about the way we consume news, like articles now no longer you're less likely to see a chart in a newspaper, like physical newspaper now, than you are on an image on social media, on a website,
right.
on a screen, right? You're more likely to see that. So perhaps again, this is a completely different episode where we sort of tear apart the idea of a dashboard, but it's less about the dashboard. It's more about like why are we consuming information in this way, and if we are we getting the right information out? Now, for example, this isn't a dashboard, but I wrote an article about scatter plots, and a couple of people on football Twitter were creating these long, elongated, rectangular scatter plots, and I was like, this is just misinformation. Now, I wrote this blog post, and it's funny. Like a couple of the feedback I got was really good article. I learned a lot, but I couldn't tell you what I learned. And I was like, oh man, that's like a failure. I've not conveyed the information. I've not taught the people anything.
And this is really important because I think going back to our champions and so on, I think we're all doing a great job. We think we are absolute stewards. Doing the best we possibly can. Very well studied. Certified
On complete information.
ways. Yes, yeah, exactly. But actually, when I was digging into the sort of underpinnings of behavioral design, it was actually alarming how little of this I know that I actually apply, and I want to start applying, because when you think about it, it actually makes sense. It's very easy to sort of understand why people respond the way they do. So maybe let's just touch on the underpinnings.
Yeah, sure.
By Boundless AI have kind of put out in their document.
Sure. So I think the first one, like the key one for me at least, is the framework, right?
Okay.
The way we actually set this out, and the way we actually come to an idea of what we're going to create, and how we're going to sort of subvert that and sort of tweak it to make sure that the audience and the idea we're trying to put across is put across, right?
Yeah.
That comes from the framework. We need to understand everything that there is from start to finish, and we need to understand the impact and the reaction people have to the set of information we're presenting.
Right, and it's actually really important, because that framework forms the it's sort of the catalyst for sort of everything else that comes along, right? Without that framework, or without that direction, you don't really have any solid basis to put things forward to people, even try and persuade them.
Right, exactly.
I think the next one's about being deliberate, right? So
yeah.
I find this it's not alarming, but it's so obvious, but it's obviously needs highlighting because it doesn't happen. And occasionally I think people actually do want to be deliberate with their dashboard designs. The whole reason you build things is to change behavior, to
make an impact.
People, make an impact. But here, what we're really talking about is actually something even more subtle than that, which isn't just making an impact, i.e. people walk away understanding your message. It's actually about making impact about the way the user uses your content, right?
Yeah, it's directing almost.
Yes, exactly.
You're giving them a direction to follow in order to act off the information you've given them. Now, I quite like this one, mainly because it harks back to a lot of the sort of client people, but people who are working in sort of design of any sort of visualization or product that is UX based. Like, I think people, if you haven't seen it, there's a great little article about like speed versus quality, right? There's a horse that's half done. Like the bottom half is a fantastically shaded, contoured horse, and the second is like a child's drawing, right? Now, that's important because I think that touches on like the fact that we are so driven by stakeholders. Right. And that defines what we are allowed to be deliberate with.
In many ways, the context kind of probably more often than not constricts what you can be deliberate with. And so you're basically left with very little that you can actually
have an impact and change with.
Yeah, exactly. It's goes back to the model we spoke about last week. I remember seeing a viz on the Tableau public gallery. I'm just scrolling the homepage now to try and hopefully find it before hopefully try and fill the air while I do this. I can't find it. I think it's moved links. But the point I was going to make was about if I take in the Tableau world, there's this competition called InViz. This is for people who don't know what it is, it's like a competition. Is it a competition even? I don't know. It's kind of like I don't know how to describe this to non-Tableau people. It's really difficult to explain. But essentially, there are feeder rounds where people submit a visualization. Some judges select vizzes that are sort of best of the crop. Each round has a theme, so it might be, for example, quantified self, one theme. Another one might be healthcare,
agriculture,
and then the winner of each theme gets to go to the Tableau conference. This year it's in Las Vegas, and on a stage in front of I don't know how many thousand people actually turn up. There's a competition and they have to build a viz. Now, in reality, they don't build it for the first time there. They've seen the data before. They get to practice it. It's kind of very well orchestrated to sort of help showcase the product, as it were. But the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the sort of entries into this thing aren't very deliberate about their design. They kind of miss the point. And they they showcase more skill than actual sort of deliberate design in the sense that they don't necessarily make the user sort of interact with the content in a way that leads them to sort of a better understanding. It's more often than not you just
Yeah.
get techniques that are being pushed around. The one that always sticks out to me is anywhere I see a Sankey diagram, because
Or anything curvy, right? Anything curvy.
yeah, well, no, just the Sankey diagram in particular. I'm not going in on this chart just because I don't like this chart. It's just you always see it used when there's a flow of data from one place to the next, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's as if there's no other simpler way that people just understand and can see immediately, that you can do it. You could even have, like, for example, a tree diagram, which is much simpler, equally technically difficult to do, but people don't seem to like want to kind of work with that. And even set actions, for example, allow you to do interactions that show you how things go from one part to the next part. I think Bethany Lyons calls it proportional brushing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are more deliberate attempts to me than some of the sort of techniques you tend to see, which are quite design centric in that sense. But I mean, that's a massive tangent on deliberate design. But
I think you make some really good points there, though. Like, for example, like I wrote a blog a couple of years ago now about long form, right? And long form as almost a cheat, because I always said, like, if you're creating a long form visualization, it's almost like, okay, I've got my first screen display of information, but I've just run out of space. So let me add on 100, 200, 300 pixels and keep making this longer or wider or bigger until I can fit all the charts, all the images, all the text on this, and suddenly it's storytelling, right? And I'm just like, I'd rather, I don't know, it's sort of like, I think this comes back to the modern day method of interacting with stuff, right? A long form visualization allows you to follow that very traditional mobile level interaction with a visualization, right? Or an image.
Right.
You're able to double tap into it, it fills your screen, and then you swipe while you're consuming the information. Again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Again,
Sorry,
the deliberate nature becomes, I'd say, the people that create these would probably argue through formatting, through deliberate design choice, through arrangement. But in terms of, I don't know, I feel like no one actively starts off with a canvas that's 400 pixels wide and 2,000 pixels long, right? You don't start with that. You always end up with that.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the other thing is that it's very easy as the build of a dashboard to sort of get caught in the excitement, as it were, if I say that rightly, right? There comes a point where this actually does happen a lot in the business context, where you're having to prove your skills as much as you are fulfill a need for the business. So when you start off building a dashboard, especially if you're new to Tableau, let's be honest, the first examples of your work are actually just you proving a point, proving that you've got the ability to do something. And so those two things can very easily kind of get muddled in. If the next one is a bit more about being scientific, right? So this idea that behavioral design is actually a scientific field, and I think it's been made largely scientific because of the way that our devices work today. If I fast forward a decade, let's say, I was listening to a podcast about the way that the internet has changed the way people interact, and the analogy they gave is this: you probably heard of flat earthers, right? So people who believe the world is flat, right? Now, imagine you walk past a flat earther in the street a decade ago, right? You just walk past them, and because you believe science, you believe their facts, and you know the facts, but you don't necessarily stop to want to change that person's opinion, right?
Correct.
You just sort of let them get on with the day, just walk on by. And maybe hundreds of other people do the same thing. Okay. Now, in that one day, one person might stop to talk to them. And so if you were to do a straw poll, you'd say, okay, 1 in 2,000 people stopped to talk to this person. And so you probably think they're just, the village loony or whatever you want to say. Okay. Now, here comes the internet. Okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the digital equivalent of this is that this one person is now talking to 6 billion people.
Hmm.
Okay. So if you do 1 in 2,000 of 6 billion people, you actually have quite a big critical mass, right?
Correct.
Whereas before, this person was preaching to no one. Now he's suddenly speaking to an audience of millions of people.
Yeah. If anyone's
And
if
it's
anyone's had a tweet go viral, the amount of your DMs blow up with like a couple of hundred people replying. But like, imagine just on the scale of like there's the concept of the ratio on Twitter, right? When there's very few likes and retweets, but like thousands of replies.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so the nature of devices today has meant that we can measure all these interactions that are happening between people, and they're amplified even larger. And so when they're amplified this way, we can even home in on what used to be really niche aspects of the way that people work in the workplace, or the communities consume information and
Yeah,
data. And so behavioral design has kind of had this sort of data driven injection and energy, combined with things like neural analysis and behavioral
yeah.
analysis. This psychological and data science kind of melding part of understanding is formed.
Yeah, and I think there's also the anthropological sense, right? And I think the point you make about the velocity of information is so important here. Like that's why
Exactly.
this is why academics are focusing on this sort of thing. This is why when we think about systematic scientific design as a part of behavioral design, they're homing in on it as these concepts that they can apply and sort of spot in nature a bit more, right? Or spot in
Right.
human behavior a bit more. And what's important is what they then are able to see is those levers, those levers that you can pull on and start working with to actually change that behavior.
Exactly, and this is kind of how the car model has actually come about, right?
Yeah.
Because people have built very sort of nice, clear understanding of, at a high level, we're not talking about if you dangle a carrot, this is what will happen. We're talking about understanding exactly what people consider rewards to be, behavior to be, and
Hmm.
habits to be, and being able to repetitively prove this sort of interaction, right? And this cycle of behavior. Because ultimately we're trying to bring about change, which is actually the next point.
Exactly, and that's where we come back to this positive point. This is the thing that the best intentions of behavior design should and large by and large are to drive positive change. For example, the
Hmm.
most like the one that I quote the most is probably about the driving license in the UK. The fact
Yeah.
that you're nudged to become a plug and order donor. It used to be opt in, now it's opt out. So you're less
Hmm.
likely to think, hang on, I'm going to opt out and not give blood away. I'm not going to share my organs once I've passed on.
Right.
And that's a positive change, right? Things like look left on the street. That's a positive change to make sure that you are doing that thing.
Hmm. Yeah. Exactly. And the last thing here is that the environment and it's so important. We talked about environment last week, how the same person in two environments, last week, a couple of weeks ago even, the same person in different environments won't necessarily achieve the same outcome,
Yeah,
because environment is so
it's
important. So
fluid.
exactly. And so the biggest Achilles heel actually in this whole topic is misunderstanding your environment, because you could have all the sort of good intentions and direction and philosophy around this, but by not understanding your environment and fundamentally not picking your moment and or people carefully, you can very easily find yourself sort of not actually having the successes you'd want, and kind of misunderstanding people's behavior. And then this can come back to bite you when we start to talk about sort of the ethical side of this, because at the end of the day, you're turning people's behaviors into a science, and when you start to do that, you start to play with something called trust.
Yeah,
And when people start to trust your product, and I'll talk about it as a product. And so when you start to talk about trust, people look at what you're doing as a product, and when you start to sort of tweak with the way people behave, and you start to do it in a scientific way, ethics start to play a really, really important part of
hmm,
this. One of the things I've talked about in the past when we talk about design is user experience, and I think this is where ethics kind of meld nicely with what we're talking about. And in a talk I gave, I talked about a concept which is the levels of user experience, and what we're really talking about is sort of something similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? But but for user experience. And it starts off at the very bottom with safety. So fundamentally, when someone starts using your analytics tool, they talk about, they think about, whether this product sort of conveys safety. Does it convey trust? Does it, follow the brand guidelines? Is it something familiar? Is the data correct? And at the very fundamental level, if you don't get this right, people won't even go to the next question, which is it useful? Is it better than what I had before?
Yeah.
Right?
Before you move on to that, I think reputation comes into this massively, because you have a reputation before you go in anyway. Like, this is the way we talk about, like, the whole thing you taught as a kid about first impressions. That's where the reputation begins.
Exactly.
And if you've got a reputation or an inkling that you're not a safe product or brand, you don't move on to utility at all.
Exactly. And in fact, people start to misconstrue your product as dangerous, and they don't want to be associated with it. I've so many times.
Self-driving cars ring a bell?
Exactly. They're actually safer than people, but the bar of safety that they have to pass is much higher because there's no human being in them, right?
Yeah.
And so it's funny. I've been in so many analytics projects where, with all good intentions, we followed the guidelines as we were told. We've been given the data by the business, but because we can't reach the same level of certainty as the business had with their existing tool, it's just so difficult to get any sort of sense on anything else, because the first thing people ask is the data correct? Is it right? And even if you preface it with the data isn't right, but what we want you to do is look and see if you like this format, just so we can get past the format issue.
Yeah.
And then we actually know what we need to build. And it's just impossible. People all struggle.
Well, my first role in my first placement at the daily school was with a guy named Ben Strauss, who's a fantastic manager to work for. And whenever a consultant we were working with said, "I'd like to use dummy data for this," Ben was like, "I've got cold sweats. Do not say that word to me again." And I was like, well, so I sort of inquired, like, I was like, dummy data makes sense. You're using a rough data set, and the numbers might not be right, but it gives you a flavor.
Yeah.
But the key thing comes down to, fundamentally, people focus on the numbers than the design or than the product itself.
Yeah, because that's where the reputation and safety is, right?
Correct.
And then, if the numbers are correct, the next thing you go to is utility.
Yeah.
Does it actually do the job it's supposed to? And actually, this is very quick and easy to evaluate, because people don't get stuck on this. What people get stuck on next is it effective?
Yeah.
You've gone through all this effort to give me something, but is it actually better than what I had before?
Correct.
And if the answer is yes, then the next thing they default to is, okay, well, fine. It's effective. It's the numbers are right. I can use it. Is it efficient? I don't know. I have to put in lots of stuff into a spreadsheet. The ETL
cognitive load as well.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to have to outsource this ETL workflow. Is that really more efficient than what we were doing before with Excel files? And if you manage to overcome that hurdle, right, and the business all in, then it goes back to satisfaction. And this is the stickiest thing ever, because I've seen dashboards that do all the previous four things: efficient, effective, well utilized, very, very correct numbers. But because people don't get the satisfaction, and by satisfaction I don't mean does it do something for them. I'm simply talking about their own sort of personal development. Does it propel me forward in my career? Does it enable me to do something? What other questions can I ask of this data, right?
Yeah.
And so you've delivered what they've asked for, but they're already thinking about the next step, and that's what they consider as satisfaction. And it's only when you sort of go one step back, and what you offer people is, here's an analytics suite of products, can you then start to talk about, fulfillment, which is, this is fun, this is enjoyable, I really like using this, it helps me with my job and my work, I can see the numbers, it's timely, it's efficient, it's organized, it's safe.
Yeah.
That is when you sort of reach the full circle, and that is so hard.
It's so hard.
It's never done with one tool.
No, and I think that self-fulfillment, I think the only thing I can think of, the only concrete example I can think of where you'll ever get to that is if the CEO of the company, right at the top, the person who owns everything, the big boss, if he's like, I like this, then suddenly it's self-fulfilling, because it's like, oh yes, I've finally succeeded. Like, it's never about the fact, like, it's never about intrinsic support and like your own personal enjoyment, right? It's all about everything that you're almost showered upon you, like that satisfaction.
Yeah. Because if you were to take this to any other industry, let's say artist or musician,
Hmm.
self fulfillment would be about expression and being understood, right? It's an art form. It's a completely different thing. Whereas you go to work and actually. Self fulfillment is a completely different sort of career orientated, sort of high level thing. And yeah, I'm not going to go into sort of the psychology of this now,
Yeah,
branching out into other topics at this rate. But going back to ethics, it's so important you keep those factors in mind, because as soon as you start to sort of fall in any of those aspects, people start to lose trust, and the ethics of the way that you're sort of handling the tool start to come into question.
yeah,
A good example is Tableau server has a Postgres database. This Postgres database collects analytics about which data sources, views are being used, when they're being used, who the authors are, down to an email level. So you could essentially see how often someone sees a dashboard. And I always love people's reaction when I highlight that you can build a dashboard that shows their usage of a dashboard, right?
yeah.
and it's one of those things where no one will ever openly go, I don't like that. But you can see that exact reaction.
They start to pale. Like one drop of sweat
Yeah,
comes down.
exactly. Yeah,
They sort
yeah.
of scribble something down.
And I don't think it's because of fear that they're going to be found out. I think it's because fear of the opposite thing, which is here we are asking for something, and for the first time, actually, someone's going to be able to look and see how we use this thing,
Hmm.
and it's a very sort of interesting tool. And I think when you think about ethics, it goes back to things like that. You don't want to turn into a nanny state where you're sending out an email going, "Oh, top user was X, bottom user was this." You need to be using that data at a high level, not really using it as like a whip as such, but more as a way of understanding behavior and trying to sort of say, well, hey, we've got this group of users who have access to the server, but they're not engaging with the content. Why is that?
Yeah, so
Not to go to them and say, why aren't you using it? But to go to them and say, hey, how could we help you use this more?
so would that be like some sort of incentive or reward for using it, would you say?
That's a tough one, because incentives and rewards aren't the same thing. I mean,
Okay.
businesses are A-class examples of confusing those two things.
Right.
I think a reward in the car model, as I see it, is not necessarily even an incentive. It's, I think we probably think of rewards in this particular use cases. Let's take something like, oh, the top user gets £5 Amazon voucher, right?
Yeah.
That's not a reward, because a reward is something where the expectation of what you get is lower than what you actually receive.
Hmm.
Okay, so the very simple terms: if I'm the top user of an analytics tool and I get an email from the head of business intelligence saying, "Well done, you were the most frequent user," and then he sends us a T-shirt or something that I actually value,
Hmm.
even if I don't like the thing he sends me or she sends me, that is a reward, because it's a surprise. I wasn't expecting it. Now, if I then end up being the top user every single month, it stops becoming a reward and it starts to become an expectation.
Hmm.
Okay. And too many times businesses get stuck in this way of describing rewards, which means that, they're not fluid. They don't move with the organization. After a while, they become an expectation.
Correct. Right. Whereas an incentive's more like, you're gonna get something if you do this today. In 5 months' time, if you get three more people, you get X, Y, and Z. Right? Like, it's sort of that
Exactly.
delayed action. I think the other game I was going to mention in this sort of area about rewards is Flappy Bird. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Flappy
Still
Bird.
have it on my phone.
Yeah, right. Flappy Bird was that weird game that had like 2 weeks of fame, and then the guy like shut it down because he was like, I can't make money off like people being idiots. Because it was such like a basic game. It was if you don't remember this. So this is a game where you tap. It's like that old helicopter game I played in high school or primary school. We like
I'll put a link in the show notes. It's still on the App Store.
Right. Okay. So basically, you hold down you tap the phone, hold it down to make the bird go up, and you have to dodge all the obstacles. Basically, right. Now,
Yeah.
no one could get past like 10 on Flappy Bird. Like you couldn't pass 10 obstacles. Everyone was getting stuck, right? And it's like that short-term intention. Basically, it's like it's a really simple game. The concept's easy, right? That's your cue. The action you do, you tap to make the bird fly up and down. Great. The reward is a high score. Now, the key thing here is that there's a shallow learning curve and there's instant gratification, right? like the more you
Right.
do, again, this comes back to Fortnite. It's a very shallow learning curve. It's a first person shooter. You basically don't try not to die.
I just died, Ravi. I just died. I got past two.
Right, exactly, right, exactly. And this was just like, because it's such a short, sharp game, you can just pick up and play. Right, like you've got that 2 minute gap when you're waiting for something, you just fire up Flappy Bird and play that, or whatever. Fortnite's different because it's like a 20, 30, 40 minute game you actually end up playing. But that sort of Q action reward, the CAR model that we keep referring to, that the aspect of the shallow learning curve and the instant gratification, does that sound familiar to you, Tim? Like, that's exactly why we love Tableau. That's exactly why we love it, because it's easy to pick up. You've got instant gratification in the building of the charts and dashboards. But it's that cycle and the process that really helps drive that ethical thing, because if you're able to control that and give that power back to the user and be very transparent with exactly what you're trying to do, and that's obvious to the user as well, as in quite a simple thing to understand, then boom, you're onto a winner.
Exactly. And it's such a tough thing to do. I think this is why this area needs more research, because first of all, I think, as we say, organizations are different. But then secondly, I think the way companies are set up to handle this, I mean, analytics teams are by no means behavioral experts. And actually, what we're talking about here is a field that needs behavioral experts. You probably need quants as well, people who can get into the numbers and understand sort of what's going on. You need data scientists to sort of take some of that behavior and start standardizing it, and try and sort of run a different type of analysis onto it, so you can maybe hope to be a little bit more predictive about sort of where you're heading.
Yeah.
And then the final aspect is obviously leadership, because once you start to see these behaviors, there's sort of the leadership bit, which is, well, do you want these behaviors to persist or do you not want them to persist, right? There's sort of so many different sort of caveats to this. And when you start tweaking these things, it's a bit like an F1 car, Formula One car. The smallest tweak over here to the suspension can change the level of wear and tear on your tires, which means that you have to do an extra pit stop, which cuts you 20 seconds, which means that you finish 10 seconds behind the leader rather than 5 seconds ahead, right?
Yeah.
And it's that kind of fine tuning that you start to really kind of get in line with once you understand the sort of the way these things work.
Cool. Yeah. So what's the now what then? What's our like takeaway for our listeners?
I guess if we start at the basics, all right. So I think I want to emphasize this point very, very hard, and that is, whatever you're building, the product is the most important thing. So if it's an analytics product, and you set out to have a dashboard that does X is the most important thing, and keeping a focus, that is the most important thing, because if you have a process which is led by anything else other than the goal, then you start to have sort of very unhealthy dynamics influencing some of what we've talked about, especially behavioral design, right? Because if I take a simple example, so often we build dashboards and we get to sort of nearly going live, and then marketing gets involved. and I don't mean marketing as in marketing the profession. I mean marketing as in the manager or the lead of something,
the person who's going to like
branded in a certain way and wants a certain label here, and
the delivery of the product.
Exactly. The owner, that's the one. The product owner, as they'd call them in the agile methodology. Marketing starts to drive what the tool is, and then you start loading your dashboard with all these things that it doesn't need, and then the user gets it and they're really unhappy.
And they're like, oh my God, there's so much here. Again, this comes back to the deliberate design.
Yeah, exactly. Product must come first, and everything else comes after. Understand how habits work in your organization. I think this really does depend on organization to organization, especially if you have a culture of analytics already. I think if you took someone from a startup sort of analytics team and you put them into an analytics team for a company that's been running for the last 100 years, it'd be a very different sort of way of working, very different. And I think you'd vastly sort of go against the grain in that sense. Tracking is absolutely essential. You need to track
the metrics,
whatever you consider as engagement metrics. It's interesting because I think people just track every metric under the sun.
I think it's also identifying those success metrics. Like, what is your actual metric that you're driving for that success, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, is it just people turning up to the Viz, or is it people returning to the Viz time and time again, or is it people sending you emails to say, "Hey, I used this once, but it was great. Thank you
Hmm.
very much.
Hmm.
Goodbye. How can I export it?" You know, uh, you know, there's so much there that is funny. On that export thing, I think people asking, I love that as an example because it's just the one that comes up time and time again. You build a what you think is a great dashboard. It's hard to say if it is or not. uh, you deliver it and then someone uses it and says, this is great, this is really fast, I love it, how can I export the data?
Yeah.
And that question drives home on two levels. It drives home on one point, which is you misunderstood their need. Like, just because they want to export doesn't mean they're wrong. Yeah.
But
If they're
I
asking
think
for an
the
export,
other flip side is when someone picks up a dashboard and you've got like a big thing front and center, but what they're really interested in is that tiny chart on the bottom left, right?
yes, exactly.
That's exactly the same. It's like you've missed the point because what the users really wanted was that bottom left chart, not
Exactly,
this thing that
exactly.
you personally find interesting.
Exactly. And so it's really interesting because so many people sort of critique that. Oh, why do you want an export? Look at this wonderful viz and stuff. And it's like, no, no, no. But you entirely missed the point because what they gave you was an expression. You asked them what they wanted and they told you what they wanted. They told you literally exactly what they wanted. But if you know, if you went back into the golden ages and said, I want a faster horse, a car would not have turned up, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's the old Henry Ford example, right?
Exactly, exactly. And so, you, you know, we kind of bang our heads on the table when users do things we don't like with them. But actually, we've got to start learning to listen to that behavior and say, okay, you want an export? Okay, let's see what happens when you do an export. Let's see where you go from
Correct.
here.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
and you know, in if I take a very simple example in Tableau, well, it's I wouldn't actually give you an export. What I'd say to you was, no, instead of an export, why don't you have access to this way of building your own dashboard so you can build your own views? Because the reason you want an export is so you can go to Excel. So why don't I make that easier for you
Yeah,
and make it easier for you to build stuff? Here's a data source rather than report.
yeah.
The
Now,
other one is when, sorry, go on.
yeah, no, could be good. Yeah, I was going to say this might be preempting what you're going to say, but the other thing is people want to see that raw number, and they want to do that
Yeah,
quick calculation themselves for their own sanity. Um,
exactly. Just to check.
exactly. Now, I think what you're saying there about you teach them, right? You teach them how to change it. You say, "What are you doing? Let me help you." That
Hmm.
thing is so important. Like that is where you create new habits. That is where you can create this new culture. The stuff we talked about in the last episode about champions.
Right.
Like
Hmm.
this is how you train and develop, and you sort of educate people. You don't push them away and sort of ridicule them. You don't say ha ha ha, you used a pie chart. You sort of you talk about what they're actually doing, and then you go from there.
Exactly. And you know, once you start to do the basics right and you start to understand these things, then you can start to kind of understand at a little bit higher level what best practices. And I think this is actually something that, I mean, level one, I think a lot of companies, I have to say, give credit to this, do this to an extent. They do track these metrics. They do understand what's going on in their organizations. They might not be able to articulate it and they might not be able to sort of point at it and put a finger on it and say,
Mm.
hey, this is what's happening. But they understand how small changes to their products will impact their users, and that means they're already at this sort of second level, which is about cultivating a culture. And uh, I think sometimes you can sort of take this too literally. When you're cultivating a culture, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've established it. It just means that you're building it and letting it grow and letting it happen. But it doesn't mean that it has to be set in stone,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, that allows people to try new things, and sort of push things in new ways. And as you're doing that, because you're measuring, you can obviously always see how people engage with it, see how people react. What catches fire, and you sort of let it run. What doesn't, well, you go back to those things and you start to understand, you know, what's going on. I think one of the best use cases I've seen of this is a client which I've worked with recently who, you know, they have about 40 analytics products on their Tableau server, and
Right.
they've built like a little report that says, you know, which ones are being used or not. And you know that they've built 40 products for various people, and for the first time they've looked at the Postgres database of dashboards, and from their perspective, all 40 dashboards have needed maintenance up until I showed them this Postgres database and the analytics behind it. And you know, some of the charts on there were saying that two people have looked at it in this month. And so they realized as a team, they're spending a whole load of time maintaining stuff it's just being serving like four people.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.